Happy March! Not only is March a great time for Michigan State basketball fans such as myself, go green, March just happens to be National Kidney Month, National Nutrition Month, and National Women's History Month. As a woman-owned business all about kidney nutrition, it's pretty much a month all about Melanie. And to celebrate, I'm offering a ton of different discounts and freebies all month long. Make sure you're on my newsletters list so you don't miss anything. You can head to kidneystonefreebie.com to make sure you're on there. Also, I have a special offer just for you as a listener of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm giving away free VIP enrollment to my signature course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. To enter for a chance to win, all you have to do is leave a review for this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, take a screenshot of the review, and email it to us at hello@thekidneydietitian.org by March 31st, 2025. Good luck and happy Kidney, Nutrition, and Women's Month. Welcome to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian, and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. After learning a ton about kidney stones and helping people prevent stones at the University of Chicago, I was fed up with all the terrible advice people were finding online. So I decided to do something about it. The Kidney Dietitian was born. This podcast is for people who want to learn what actually works to prevent kidney stones and still enjoy life, eating, and their favorite foods. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the 86th episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. As always, I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. And today I'm actually answering a question that was asked in my Kidney Stone Facebook group this past week. And I thought it was a wonderful question, and it does come up fairly often, so I thought that I would tackle it on the podcast today. And that is, what does fat have to do with kidney stone nutrition? Does it matter? Is this part of what we talk about, et cetera, et cetera? So generally, no. Like a low or high fat diet within reason hasn't necessarily been associated with kidney stones. However, we eat on diet that includes fat. And so obviously that has to be something that you think about when you're kind of putting together an entire dietary pattern for kidney stones. And so I do have some things to say about it because it is important, definitely, in pretty much any kidney stone dietary pattern or any dietary pattern in general, right? We want to be eating some fat because fat definitely provides us with essential energy and nutrients and antioxidants and these types of things. So here are kind of my big thoughts about fat for people with kidney stones. So the first thing that comes to mind is kind of the macronutrient breakdown, if you will. So macronutrient is just a fancy term that refers to nutrients that provide energy, essentially. There are 3 macronutrients. Period. Well, 4 if you include alcohol, but we generally don't want to be getting a significant amount of calories from alcohol. So we're not including that in our discussion today. So there are 3 macronutrients. They are protein, fat, and carbohydrate, right? And so all of your fuel, like the energy and calories that your body needs to function and to be healthy and to feel your best, needs to come from these 3 sources: carbohydrate, protein, and fat. So since for kidney health in general, including kidney stones, typically we don't want a super high protein diet. So we don't want a large percentage of calories coming from protein because that leads to, a whole host of other reasons. And I've talked about that previously. But since we need those calories from someplace, and since we don't want a large piece of that pie coming from protein, that means we need to have calories from carbohydrate and fat. So I'll talk about carbohydrates first, and then I'll dive into the fat. So I know that carbs have such a terrible reputation, but I am here to tell you that carbs are good for you. Carbs are actually crucial for general health. It's the primary source of energy that all of your cells use, including like your brain and actually your kidneys and some other things. So carbs are not bad, especially when we're talking about kidney stone nutrition, because we know that ketogenic or low carb diets are very significantly associated with kidney stones. And I've talked about that in previous episodes too, so I won't talk about that now, but definitely we do not want a low carb diet when we are focusing on kidney stone prevention. And so we want carbs in the diet. We want them because they provide us that crucial energy. they're actually the largest part of the pie when we think about where we want most of our energy coming from. But of course, we want most of our carbohydrate coming from sort of our minimally processed whole grain options. So some great whole food sources of carbohydrate are things like whole grain bread, whole grain pasta, oatmeal, or my personal favorite, my snack literally just today and most days, is popcorn. That's also a whole grain. There's also a lot of, I call them sort of like fancy designer whole grains. So things like quinoa or bulgur or wheat berries or barley, right? There's tons of like, the like sort of zero processed whole grains, if you will. Those are all whole grains. Those are all carbohydrates, including fruit, right? You're also going to get some carbohydrate from fruit. And we know that fruit is very, very good for kidney stone prevention in general. And also dairy, which we know is also very good for kidney stone prevention. So these are these are the foods that we want our carbohydrate coming from. I also want a quick caveat. I know that I mentioned a ton of whole grains, and these may have been demonized by low oxalate lists. But you know that I do not love a low oxalate diet when it comes to kidney stone prevention, including calcium oxalate kidney stone prevention. And one of the reasons is because on a strict low oxalate diet, there's no way that you can eat whole grains. It just simply would not fit into a healthy dietary pattern that is limited to, say, 50 or 100 milligrams of oxalate per day. And whole grains are such a critical part of the big picture, like where we're getting our energy, and also our fiber, and also a ton of very potent kidney stone inhibitors. So things like, there's something called phytate, which I've talked about before, magnesium, potassium, like all of these really good things you get from whole grains. And so that is sort of one of the many reasons why I don't love a low oxalate diet, and certainly not a strict low oxalate diet, because it simply does not allow for healthy foods like whole grains, which are actually good for kidney stones. So that's all. I'm talking about carbs, because I know I'm supposed to be talking about fat this episode, but when you're talking about the one macronutrient, it has to fit into the context of all the others. And so I just wanted to touch on carbs for this episode. So the last piece of that pie, or the last chunk of our energy and our calories, has to come from fat. And again, if we are eating a lower protein, or not even a low protein, for stones, we actually don't recommend a low protein diet. We just recommend not eating more protein than you need, or not a high protein diet. So that means we need to get some of those calories from fat. Fat is, in addition to fiber, it's one of the nutrients that helps keep us full. If you've ever, maybe especially in like the 90s, right, low-fat diets were very trendy, and it's what we recommended, and now we know better. Low-fat diets are not the best for a variety of reasons. So fat helps keep us full, right? Like if you try to eat a low-fat or no-fat diet, you probably feel really hungry, because fat helps keep food in our stomach longer, helping us stay full and satiated, which is a really good thing. So again, when we think about fat and kidney stones, we're not necessarily thinking about like a high or low fat diet, but because we want that protein to kind of fit and not take up the majority of our calories, we need to have some of those calories from fat. And as I mentioned earlier in the episode, fat does good things for us. There's antioxidants if you're getting primarily heart healthy or quote good fats. They have that satiating factor and some other benefits. Our bodies definitely need fat to function. Of course, not all fats are created equal. And so especially since people with kidney stones are unfortunately at higher risk of things like heart disease and kidney disease, I think it definitely makes sense to focus on like the general healthy recommendations that we think about when it comes to heart healthy fats. So you should probably be getting most of your fat from healthy oils and healthy fat. So for example, things like olive oil, canola oil, avocado oil, walnut oil, in general, plant oils in general are going to be your healthier options, with the one exception of tropical oils. So coconut oil is obviously from a plant, but tropical oils like coconut oil actually tend to be higher in saturated fat than even butter. I know that there's a lot of information out there about how coconut oil is good for you, but that simply is not based in any research. And the reality is it actually, again, has more saturated fat in it than butter does, and eating excessive amounts of saturated fat definitely seems to have negative impacts on our heart health. So I actually don't recommend coconut oil as a heart healthy option. It's delicious. And so if you want to use it because you love it, like that's one thing. It's not that you can't use it, but it's not something that we should be actively trying to choose necessarily for health. Also, quick note, I can't mention canola oil or some of the other oils that I mentioned without probably getting some hate from people saying that seed oils are bad for you. This is simply false. This is not based in any data. In fact, if anything, seed oils are anti-inflammatory. I will actually link to a different podcast from some of my favorite nutrition influencers that are actual dietitians or people with medical degrees that really dive into the science behind seed oils to help you understand that they are actually not bad, especially when we're eating them in a healthy dietary pattern. I think they get demonized because they tend to be in a lot of ultra-processed foods. Like, sure, eating seed oils and Doritos all day is probably not the best for you, but if you are using seed oils to saute your vegetables, like that's actually a health-promoting choice. So I digress again. So many caveats in this episode, so many things to talk about. But these are all generally foods that have healthy or health-promoting benefits that we want to be getting most of our fat from. Obviously, we can also get fat from things like avocado or nuts, salmon or other fatty fish. These are all really, really good, healthy sources of fat. And although one type of fat isn't necessarily associated with kidney stones or not over the other, I think when we're thinking about this whole thing from a general health standpoint, especially from the standpoint of people with stones are at higher risk, again, of heart and kidney disease, I think it definitely makes sense to be focusing on getting most of our fats from these healthier food sources. There is a very, very small amount of research that actually shows that omega-3 fatty acids, which are the fatty acids, specifically DHA, which is a specific type of omega-3 fatty acid that's found in fatty fish, can actually essentially reduce how much oxalate your liver makes, primarily through this anti-inflammatory, changing the way this inflammatory cascade works. But long story short, there is a small amount of data that shows that these omega-3, specifically DHA, can actually reduce urine oxalate, which is pretty cool. I have recommended fish oil for patients before if you have high urine oxalate that we can't get down, which is honestly very rare. Only about 20% of people who have calcium oxalate stones have high urine oxalate in the first place. And in my experience, about 90% of the time, if oxalate was high in the first place, we can get it down by making sure we get in enough calcium. However, I've certainly had people with really stubborn high urine oxalate, and in those cases, I do recommend a fish oil supplement because again, there's a little bit of data that shows that it might help, and I think there's honestly very little risk of taking a fish oil supplement other than the cost, certainly, because that's certainly a risk with any supplement. But I think, in light of that little bit of research and in light of the very, very well-established benefits of getting in those healthy fats from things like fish, I think it certainly makes sense to, if you do eat fish, to try to get in fatty fish 1 or 2 times a week to get a little bit more of those extra omega-3s. And especially if you have high urine oxalate, that's definitely something that you might want to think about. I also wanted to quickly touch on dairy because I talk about dairy quite a bit here on the Kidney Dietitian as a great source of calcium, and dairy certainly comes with fat. Of course, we can get low fat, fat-free, and regular dairy, whether we're talking about yogurt, milk, or cheese, or whatever. So the fat in dairy is mostly saturated. And dairy also has cholesterol in it. There is data that shows that for whatever reason, the saturated fat that comes from dairy, especially milk and yogurt, doesn't seem to be associated with the same negative outcomes that we see saturated fat from, say, red meat or bacon or something. It doesn't have that same association with negative heart impacts. So I think I'm not basically I don't think that we all need to necessarily be eating low-fat or fat-free dairy just because of the saturated fat content. However, I know that many of you are struggling with managing everything that we talk about for kidney stone nutrition and high cholesterol levels. And I think that if that is you, and especially if you are adding, say, those 3 servings of dairy a day, I think it does probably make sense to choose either low-fat or fat-free dairy options, just because it's going to help keep that saturated fat down just in case, right? It's also going to be lower in calories, and that is sometimes a concern for people as well. There's pretty much the same amount of calcium across all levels of fat when you're looking at, low fat versus fat-free and full fat yogurt and milk. So from a calcium standpoint, I don't really care. It's all pretty much the same. Also, I feel like there's a lot of hate out there for low fat or fat-free products because they're, quote, full of chemicals, which is just fear-mongering because chemicals aren't necessarily bad. But I did want to mention that that lower fat dairy products typically don't have a lot of extra stuff added to them. It's literally just milk with the fat removed, or yogurt with the fat removed, or some of the fat removed, right? In the case of lower fat options. Another criticism of low-fat products is that they are typically higher in things like added salt or sodium, which is definitely the case. I find, like with peanut butter, for example, the low-fat actually has more sugar and sodium, I believe, in it, depending on the brand, because they have to add something in it to make it taste good, and fat also helps make our food taste good, which is a benefit that I didn't mention earlier. But if you are getting just plain low-fat yogurt or just low-fat, reduced-fat milk or whatever, again, it just has less fat in it. It typically doesn't also have extra salt or sugar added to it. Obviously, check the brand. I'm sure that someone will find a brand that proves me wrong, but as a general rule, low-fat dairy doesn't have any extra stuff added to it. It's just dairy without as much fat. So I'm sure that people are going to ask, what's the ideal breakdown of macronutrients, or macros as sort of the gym bros might call them. And honestly, there's not an official breakdown or percentage that is recommended for people with kidney stones. But if I had to give a general recommendation, I would say maybe 60-ish% of your calories coming from carbohydrate. So note that is the largest percentage, coming from whole grains and fruit and dairy, these types of things. Maybe 25 to 30% fat. So this is pretty much in line with what the general advice is for healthy eating, right? We don't want a high fat diet necessarily, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we do want some calories from fat, again, especially so we don't have to eat a larger percentage of our calories from protein, and then maybe 10 to 15-ish% of your calories from protein. But this is going to be vastly different for different people. Definitely ask your doctor or your dietitian if this is something that you are concerned about. I will also say that I don't advocate for counting your macros, or honestly tracking your food in general for a long period of time, because I think that this is honestly miserable and is no way to live, and can very easily slide into disordered eating and sort of this hyper unhealthy awareness of what you're eating, right? There's certainly a balance with all things. So I think that tracking your food can be helpful for a short amount of time to kind of check in with yourself to see where you are, especially in terms of how much protein you're eating, say, or how much sodium you're eating or added sugar. But I don't love for people to do this for a long period of time, say more than 3 days or a week or so. Just again, because I think it just takes all joy out of eating, which is the exact opposite of what I want for you. I also needed to mention I cannot do a fat kidney stone podcast episode without talking a little bit about fat malabsorption, or conditions where your body isn't absorbing fat the way that it should. Specifically, the two conditions that are most known for this when it comes to stones is inflammatory bowel disease. So that is either Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, or people who have had gastric bypass surgery, especially a very malabsorptive gastric bypass surgery, such as a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass surgery. So any condition, or any health condition or surgery or something that causes your body to not absorb fat has the potential to increase the risk of stones. Essentially what happens is your body, fat ends up lower in your intestines where it shouldn't be, like normally it would have been absorbed already. And then that fat sort of keeps calcium away from oxalate. So what ends up happening is people with gastric bypass surgery or IBD often have this massive overabsorption of oxalate, which results in insanely high amounts of urine oxalate, which obviously increases the risk of stones. And so this is obviously very, very specific. I'm sure most of you listening don't have IBD or have gastric bypass surgery or an ileostomy or short bowel syndrome or whatever it is. But I do think that there is some concern that the same mechanism could happen. Like you could have that fat blocking the calcium from binding oxalate to stop that oxalate from getting absorbed if you are eating a super duper high fat diet. Like, for example, if you're having diarrhea, whether you're sick or from whatever, that likely is fat malabsorption is happening, right? Like if you're having diarrhea, your body is not absorbing things from food the way that it should because it's just moving through your system way, way too fast. And I imagine that most of us have experienced diarrhea after a super high fat meal, right? Like a big steak or tons of chicken wings or I don't know, some other really, really high fat meal oftentimes results in diarrhea for people. And so I think that if you are doing that a lot consistently, it would be reasonable to assume that there would be that fat malabsorption could be leading to a higher oxalate absorption. But this is totally me just kind of guessing. There's no data to really back that up. But we know that eating a ton of fat isn't great for us anyway. So that's probably not something we want to be doing. But just wanted to mention that in this podcast episode about fat and kidney stones. So I will end this episode with my advice that I always give, because it cannot be said enough, that the right diet for you is going to be completely different from every single other person with kidney stones, right? The right diet for you has to be based obviously on your 24-hour urine test, which tells us why you're forming stones, which gives us any idea what we can do to prevent them. If you are trying to prevent stones and don't have a urine test, you're literally just guessing. I talk about all that all the time, but the right diet for you is based not only on that, it's also based on your other medical history, right? Very rarely people just have kidney stones. We also have, say, diabetes or heart disease or high blood pressure or IBD or whatever it is, right? And so you have one diet to eat, and that diet has to address all of your health concerns. And so the right diet is going to be very, very different for you. The right diet is also going to be different based on the foods you like to eat, right? We all have different food preferences, and that's totally fine. Like, we do not need to be eating white rice or brown rice and chicken and broccoli to be healthy. Like that's how boring and right? We all have different foods that we like to eat, and the right diet for you is going to reflect the foods that you like to eat. We also all have very different access to foods and cooking methods and time, right? We have different amounts of money to spend on food, especially these days with grocery prices being quite high. I just paid this past week, I think I paid $13 for 18 eggs, right? We also have different amounts of time to cook. So I have twin, almost 3-year-olds, and I have much less time to cook than I used to, and that has dramatically impacted the types of foods that I'm eating. So all of these things need to be taken into consideration when you are trying to figure out the best way to go about this for you. And working with a registered dietitian is truly the only way to put this all together, right? A registered dietitian is trained to look at you as a whole, look at all of those things that I just mentioned and more, honestly, and put together the right eating plan for you. And as always, if you want to work with us at the Kidney Dietitian, we would love to have you. I work with people all over the country in my course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. And I also have a team of Kidney Stone certified registered dietitians who can work with you one-on-one and really dive into all of these things that we talked about and put together a plan that works for you. So if you just head to thekidneydietitian.org/work with us, or you can find it in the menu at the top of the page, you can learn more about both of those options. And both of those options are also linked in the show notes as well. So with that, I will end this episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I hope that this was helpful. Like I said, this was a question that was submitted just recently from a member of the Facebook group, and definitely something that comes up pretty often because we just don't talk about fat and kidney stones, right? Like we talk about protein all the time, maybe carbohydrates. I guess we do talk about carbs in terms of that low carb diet not being great, but we really don't talk about fat. So wanted to kind of complete the picture and put this information out into the world. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again next time on the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For more help with kidney stones, check out my website, www.thekidneydietitian.org. For more personalized help from me, check out my online course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. VIP enrollment includes help directly from me. I can't wait to see you there and help you prevent kidney stones. Have a great day.